This podcast is brought to you by the School of Advanced Study, University of London.
This is the first occasion in this seminar series where we've had a talk about family history. And it's a real pleasure to welcome Anne-Marie because she's one of the very few people who's made a sustained in-depth study into it, not in terms of the nuts and bolts or the websites or the number crunching, but the cultural meaning and the social context in which this very increasingly important phenomenon takes place. She's a lecturer in sociology and social policy at Nottingham University, and the first thing she said to me this evening was, my degree was in history. So I'm on the right track. She was previously at Warwick. She's been focusing in recent work on family heritage, if you like, on the cultural status of genealogy, and I'm delighted to have her here and I'm looking forward to what she has to say.
Thank you very much, John, and thank you for inviting me here today to speak to you. In terms of what I'm going to do today, as I'll make clear, I'm going to talk very much about the First World War, and that's because that's the area that I'm looking at the moment, not least because it's so prominent in public consciousness and because there's so much activity going on at the moment in terms of commemoration. So I'll say a little bit about that later on when I'm introducing the paper, but just to make it clear that I've had to focus this somewhere. I can talk more generally about family history and practices of family history in relation to this question because this is only one part of a much larger research project, but nevertheless I'm going to focus on the First World War today. Okay, so it hardly needs me to say anything really about the so-called family history boom. I've put that in inverted commas, not least because family historians have told me that the practice of family history and indeed the research of family history has been going on for a very long time, and in fact there's questions around whether or not this is something new or that it's more visible or somehow more sustained, a more sustained activity. So I put the inverted commas in deference to genealogists who have argued very strenuously with me that boom is not the right word to describe it. Nonetheless, it's very visible now, and of course that's for a number of reasons: unparalleled public access to historical records, both in physical and in digital archives, but it's also to do with new technologies of access, so indexes being searchable, so the way that you access the information being different and more accessible to the general public. It's also a media phenomenon, as we all know, through Who Do You Think You Are and other genealogy programmes, so it's part of consumer celebrity culture as well, so it's visible in lots of different ways. And I've argued elsewhere that at the same time, genealogy, however we define that, and I could give a paper just on different definitions of genealogy and family history too, that knowing who it is, who one is, seems to still depend on where one has come from. Now, of course, who one is can't be reducible to the people that come before because they're separate individuals. And that's a bit of a paradox, actually. That's something I won't take forward in the paper today. But nonetheless, there's this idea that somehow people are ontologically insecure. They don't know who they are if they don't know their past. Although it's not their past, it's their ancestors' past. But there's a real slippage there, an interesting slippage. So work on family history has tended to focus on why it is that people do it, and I won't go into this in detail, but of course the keeping of genealogies is widespread both in pre-industrial and post-industrial societies. It's been used for specific purposes to validate lineage. It has a particular classed and a gendered dimension to it because it's about maintaining property, it's about maintaining bloodlines, and it's about patrilineality. But more recently, family history genealogy has also been used as a vehicle to recover groups and individuals previously lost to history. So it has this interesting tension at the heart of it, where it is both about the recuperation of individuals and groups, marginal and lost, previously lost, and at the same time it has this much more sort of conservative trajectory to it. There are two groups of reasons advanced for why genealogy is important. The first is social explanations, which we'd characterise as a reaction to depersonalised modernity or a weakening of family bonds, or a concern, at least, that such bonds are being weakened, even if they're not being weakened in actuality. A response to a crisis in belonging in post-colonial societies, as Paul Boussu has argued, a reaction to social dislocation, a reaction to migration. These are all different kinds of reasons, social reasons that have been advanced for why genealogy is now so popular. But we have to remember also personal reasons, because these are quests of the self as well, in the sense that there can be a spiritual dimension to family history, or a compulsion to remember in order to locate the self, particularly, for example, in cases of adoption or uncertain parentage. But it can also be pleasurable. Others have talked about genealogy as serving some kind of personal advantage, where one, if you like, accrues resources to bolster the self. So, thus far then, the majority of academics looking at family history as a cultural phenomenon have been interested in why people do family history. I'm actually less interested in that, in the sense that I'm interested in what it is that family history does. So what does it achieve? What does it do? Of course, family history is also, as John Tosh has written, a form of identity history, so it's related to projects of the self, and I will be talking a little bit about that. I want to add in too that we mustn't forget the family. I think when people talk about the meaning of family history, they quite often talk about individuals, but they don't always talk about the way that family history relates to an individual embedding themselves within a network, within a family. Okay, I won't talk a long time about this, but I've written elsewhere about the way that family history functions in terms of kinship. So the way that family history plays out within families, the way that individuals, for example, use it to embed themselves within family networks. I belong here because I've got this kind of nose, or I have an affinity with this branch of the family that we didn't know about until 5 years ago, because they're all scientists and so am I, and the rest of my family are artists. So those kinds of practices, the way that genealogy is used in very productive ways for people to locate themselves, and also to dislocate themselves from context too, where they feel they don't fit. So it's kind of an accounting for the self. I've also talked about family history in relation to particularly Who Do You Think You Are, and the kind of experience that celebrity participants get from being on Who Do You Think You Are, and what is seen to be meaningful about the process of genealogy for the participants, and the way that that's kind of dramatised and made into spectacle for audiences. And that's very much focused on the way that emotion is seen to be evidence of historical engagement, which I think is really interesting. I've also looked at the ways in which family history can tell us about the multidimensionality of history as people engage and experience with it, and the way that individuals who do family history slip between talking about themselves as individuals and the experience of ancestors as individuals, to that being reflective of the family's history, and that then being able to talk about the relationship of that family's history to the nation, however we might imagine that more generally. So there's an interesting kind of slippage there. And I'm also interested in embeddedness in time. I'll talk a little bit about that today. And the book which I'm trying to finish is on kinship and genealogy. Hopefully one day it will actually be finished. Okay, so that's a little bit about how I've got to what I'm doing at the moment. My current preoccupations then, there are a few, and they feed into the paper I'm giving today. And it comes from an understanding, I think, that the past is meaningful not just to historians, but to the public in lots of different ways. And one of the ways that the past circulates in the present is through family stories, and family stories about the family. And it's so mundane and it's so everyday that we take it for granted and we don't see it. It's not visible to us because it's so everyday and so taken for granted. So I'm interested then in the idea of what historical awareness might mean for so-called ordinary people. I don't think people are ordinary at all. I'm located in the Department of Sociology. I couldn't be there if I thought people were ordinary, for sure not. But what does this mean? This sense, we can put this in a different way then, this sense of history, a sense of the past, the sense of being influenced by the past and being located in a particular point in time in relation to what has gone before. What does that mean for people that aren't historians, that are just in the everyday? And how do they locate themselves within the past, within the stream of history? So how do they see the relevance of what has gone before to who they are and how they live in the present? That's something I find really interesting. Related to this, then, why and how does history, or the past, not necessarily structured narratives around the past, however we understand history or remnants of the past, how does that matter in everyday and family lives? And that's getting at this kind of mundane circulation of narratives about the past? And how does history relate to social memory? So what processes of myth-making are there around the significance of particular stories or particular ancestors, and how that relates to particular local or community or national narratives more generally? What uses thus are made of the past, and to what ends? Now that's a huge question and articulates in so many different contexts, but I'm going to apply it in relation to family history today. And so to try and take up some of these preoccupations, I'm looking at World War I, as I've said today. So as a good sociologist, I'm going to tell you about my methodology. So in terms of what I'm going to be drawing on today, I can talk more widely about my research into family history, but I'm going to be drawing from my evidence and my data, again, sociologist, on a mass observation directive which was commissioned in autumn 2014. Is everybody aware of and familiar with the mass observation archive? Fantastic. Okay, so this directive was on the First World War, and there were several sections to it. There was, the first part asked for 10 key words on what you associate with the First World War. The second part was a focus on remembering, and I'll take you through those questions in a minute. The next part asked for traces of the First World War, so what could they see that was kind of visible in terms of the First World War. The next part related to media, so what had they thought about media engagement with World War I and the way that different commemorative activities were being staged through drama, through art and so on. And then the next section went on to ask about books and poetry, where really mass observers listed all the books they'd ever read in relation to the First World War, which was quite dense and lengthy, and there was, all the favourites were in there for the most part. And then there was another question about the Battle of Fromelles and whether or not DNA should be used to be able to determine who people were, to be able to return them to their families, as it were. And lastly, there was a day diary for Remembrance Sunday. I can talk more generally about the directive if you'd like it in the questions. One thing that was really interesting, although I won't be talking about today, was how many people were hostile to commemoration. So much hostility. It was really, really interesting, really critical, engaged rejection of commemoration. Very interesting.
Sorry, was this your directive?
No, it wasn't. It was actually commissioned by Lucy Noakes at Brighton. Yeah. So I piggybacked on her.
Okay.
So no, I didn't write the questions. Okay, so the section which was on remembering asked the following questions, and there were a lot of questions in this directive. I should add also that I have also had experience myself of commissioning a directive, so I know how hard it is to choose those questions. So you're locked in then, and as you're reading the responses and wishing you had asked something different, you've got no possibility of changing your mind about what you'd like to ask. Nonetheless, remembering, do stories about the First World War feature in your family? If so, who tells them? Are these of the home front and or the battlefront? Could you describe some of these for us? Does your family have any mementos or souvenirs of the First World War? What are these? Where are they kept? Are they important to your family? Do you or does your family observe Remembrance Day? Please tell us about how you do this. Do you associate Remembrance Day with the First World War or with other wars? Are there any gaps between your family's memories from the First World War and what's covered in the media or featured in commemorative activity? Now that was only one section of a much bigger directive, so there was lots to talk about. Okay, so with what I'm going to look at today, I'm going to focus particularly on the first and the second question. I can talk more generally about the others if you're interested in finding out what people wanted to say. So in terms of what I'm going to be looking at then, I'm going to be thinking about the way that memory and identity works in terms of this generational transmission. I'm going to talk about the different form of remembrance practices as described in the directive responses, and I'm going to talk about how that's related quite often, more often than not, to particular artefacts, particular objects. So I'm going to start off by talking about the value of family history and heritage. The point I want to start off with is that it's by no means taken for granted that family heritage, family history should be important to individuals and to families. Both in earlier research I've done and in this research, I found that there are a substantial minority of people who are quite hostile to family history, and that's very interesting, who describe it as not being relevant to them, not having purchase on their lives. I haven't found that yet in terms of this directive response. However, I would say it is contested. It's important to some writers, but not to all. It's not important to all because some people say it's not in our family, as I'll go on to say. There's no stories there. It's not seen to have significance. It's not seen to be particularly important to us. Respondents, mass observation respondents, talk about doing honour to previous generations and to their sacrifice, but I'm surprised that that's not as big a theme as I might have expected, given the wider context of commemoration. But it is there. But alongside that, we have respondents talking about the pointlessness of remembering, the pointlessness of family history, because these are events which should be forgotten because they are so horrific that they should be erased. So, for example, no stories feature in my family, nor in my wife's, nor have any of my friends ever mentioned any to us. Consequently, we have no mementos or souvenirs. Does anyone want to be reminded of senseless horror that served no purpose? This was quite an elderly gentleman. He was in his 80s. And he was quite clear that actually quite off-put at the idea that objects should be kept and perform this kind of commemorative function when actually there was nothing to be achieved through that because the experiences were so horrific. For others, the First World War was something that had happened too far in the past, that these were events which were distant and irrelevant from life at hand. And although we're talking about the First World War here, this is also borne out in other research I've done on family history more generally, where the family history that's being recounted might only be 30 or 40 years ago, but nonetheless it still seemed to be too distant or too irrelevant because it's not related to that individual's immediate life experiences. So, for example, in fact, even in my own family, I can say no siblings or their offspring are bothered. It's too far in the past, and I never met them anyway. Okay, so... And another. In fact, my knowledge of the First World War is minimal, as it feels distant and irrelevant to me. There was also quite an interesting amount of slippage with some respondents' responses between the First World War and the Second World War. Actually, that was quite interesting. We had a little bit of throat clearing at the start of this section from some people who'd say, First World War, yes, that was the one with the battlefields, wasn't it? Yeah. And the Second World War, that was the tanks. And actually, they were trying to distinguish between the First World War and the Second World War because their idea of what those events meant was quite hazy. That wasn't many people, but it definitely was quite a few. Others talked about, and again I found this in other research I've done on family history more generally, talked about the value of family history and heritage in that they had performed some role in saving it from being destroyed, that somehow family heritage, because it is passed down the generations, whether that's stories or whether that's artefacts, is at each stage of the transmission, if you like, liable to be lost or to be damaged or to be misunderstood. The certificate hangs on the wall. They are important to me. The certificate I rescued from a skip after the niece who had looked after it had died. Perhaps they might be important to the younger family when, like me, they have time to reflect. So this particular respondent was talking about the fact that his immediate family below him, in terms of the generation, weren't interested, but they might too be interested in the future. And this story of rummaging about in skips and also chasing after bin lorries, I've encountered quite a few times. Somebody else wrote, I can remember when I was younger seeing a postcard album which came to my parents. For some reason, my mother gave this to my aunt and uncle after my father died. I would have liked to keep it, I must admit. And this again is a kind of recurring narrative of the idea that, if you like, the family jewels are passed on to the wrong member of the family, particularly where they don't feel that they really understand the meaning of it, and actually it would be best cherished and best protected with them rather than with another family member. There are also lots of stories as well of family historians talking about the fact that other members of the family are holding on to pieces of information that they won't divulge. So this relates to a wider sort of politics around family history and the way that plays out within families. However, family history, family heritage, was not seen to be equally important to all. That's not surprising, of course, but some talked about the fact that that was not just an individual disposition, but that actually that was reflective of the family as a whole, that the entire family wasn't really interested in the past, that was something they didn't really talk about, something that wasn't part of their familial culture, if you like. I am not aware of mementos or souvenirs. My family tend to move on, as she put in inverted commas, from bad situations and do not hoard items. There's all sorts of judgments being made there about the fact that people wallow in First World War history because it's necessarily tragic, and that holding on to things is somehow a negative activity. So that's quite interesting in itself. So in that respect, there is little to show our links with the past, she says. But she doesn't describe that as being a problem. It's just that that's not what they do in her family. So there are different practices within families in terms of collecting, in terms of relating to the past, and if you like, the purchase of the past in the present. Okay, so that's a little bit about the value of family history and heritage. I'm going on to talk now about who and what is remembered, to what ends and effects. And it's probably the part of the paper that I've worked on least in terms of understanding this, because it's something I'm still working through. But I think what's interesting in this and in work I've done before is that for some there is a compulsion to remember. Remembering is something which is seen to be desirable, sometimes when there are no stories, and sometimes when there are stories or artefacts which have to be taken care of. So it's not just that the compulsion to remember is around a particular individual. It might be that people talk, whether they're family historians or not, talk about the absence of stories in their family as being problematic. Sadly, I have no stories of my family's experiences from the First World War. My story then, of course, they're talking again, there's that slippage between that person's story and the story of people that participated in the First World War, that kind of seemingly logical step from one to the other. My story is therefore not one that will be passed on by me. So it's almost as if that person comes to an end, stops because they're unable to pass on the past themselves. It's really interesting. There's a certain shame to that. I think she doesn't mean shame as in stigma. I think she means it's a pity. More about shame in the other sense in a minute. There's a certain shame to that. I feel I should know what my ancestors' experience was, good or bad. There's almost a moral imperative to this, that this respondent has the obligation to know about the past. And for her, it's then that she can know about herself. So again, we have that quest for the self narrative appearing. We also, in the directive responses, see deliberate silences, deliberate forgetting, and these are often accompanied by regret. My grandparents were born too late for the First World War. After my nan passed away, my dad and uncles found an old picture of a young man wearing an army uniform taken around the time of the outbreak of the First World War. Unfortunately, as my nan did not like talking about her childhood, in brackets, we believe she may have been adopted. There's the rub. We have no real idea who this young man may have been or what his fate was. So sometimes artefacts throw up questions rather than answers. That's going to be unresolved. They can't solve that riddle. They can't find out who it is. I think what's interesting here is that family history, as I've written about elsewhere, is not just about passing on stories, but it's also only ever made possible by the absence of knowledge. So it's to do with a secret being uncovered and being explored. So it's about, if we already knew about our extended family network and about all our relatives, as Marilyn Strathern says, then we wouldn't need genealogy or family history in the first place. We'd already know it all. But of course we don't. It's only because of forgetting that we need this process of recuperation through family history and through genealogy. Another quote. My father served in World War II, and rarely spoke about his experiences. So I think this was the norm in our family, not to dwell on war and those lost as a result. Again, note this slippage between the Second World War and the First World War. And what this respondent is doing is characterising this as, again, in terms of family culture, on the basis of what seems quite slender evidence to me. But nonetheless, that's I'm not in the business of identifying whether or not that's truthful. It's interesting that she poses that as a family culture. So their family pattern then is to not remember, if you like. Another point I wanted to make is that quite often respondents talked about whether or not their family were born, as it were, at the right time to remember the First World War. So for some, it just didn't quite fit in terms of the generation, so there wasn't anybody who had gone through the experience of being in battle or on the home front to then pass on the family stories in the way that was expected. They did write about that as well. Another respondent wrote, my grandmother would not say much as it was too painful, as it completely altered her life as her mother remarried. So as a consequence of her father dying on the battlefield, her mother had then remarried subsequently, and of course the trajectory of that child's life had changed quite greatly. So here we can see that actually stories can cast quite long shadows in the sense that their absence has still marked a generation on. There were other stories, which I won't go into too much detail about, of Zeppelin bombing in London, and there was somehow this idea in some of the directive responses that World War I, especially for elderly respondents, somehow those stories were in the backdrop of family life, if I can put it that way, that they kind of made appearances at particular times, and they weren't there all the time, but they were still tangibly there in the background somehow. Okay, the role of text and material objects in remembering then. Objects endure. Clearly the people who experienced World War I, whether on the home front or on the battlefield, are long dead, whether or not in battle or through old age. But the objects endure, and this is something that respondents talked through. For many, and given the directive asked about where objects were kept, they were in the loft. This was a this was a phrase that came out again and again, if you like. Family jewels. They're important, but they're not. They're somewhere safe. Somewhere they're not going to get in the way, but we know where they are. There was a kind of almost a sort of comforting ring to that. They're in the loft. So, for example, we have mementos of the First World War in that there is a photograph of my paternal grandfather in his uniform and a metal trunk that he had with his initials on it in the loft of my mother's house. Similarly, my great-grandfather's war medals are kept safe in my dad's desk. So she actually comments on the fact that they're taking good care of them, hence, that nurturing aspect to it, right? They're not just, we know where they are, but we know that they're safe, we're taking care of them. We don't ever sit down as a family, she says, and talk about them, although there is an unmentioned acceptance in the house that these are treasured things. Now, that's quite interesting. So they're important, but they're not talked about. So it comes back into this, what I was trying to say before, in terms of the past being present, but in a way which is not necessarily talked about, not necessarily visible, not necessarily tangible, but that there's this kind of circulating awareness around it. Everybody knows that that's where they are. Others talked about family heritage, like medals, like tin boxes, like gas masks, being precious objects that needed to be looked after, that needed to be nurtured, and as I'll go on to say, to be passed on. My paternal grandfather was in the First World War, serving as a sapper. Nobody ever talked about the war in our family. My grandfather was an invalid, sitting in a chair all the time and coughing into a little pot. I did not realise then that he had been gassed. I never really knew him, as I was only 7 when he died. I have photographs of my grandfather in his uniform. There are 2 medals, plus his ID disc. I have given them to my son. I think they are important, and hope they will not get lost. There's a few things to say about this. I think the first is that it's interesting that the mass observer, like many mass observers, talks about shifting selves across their life course. They don't just talk as themselves. They relate back to past experiences as children, as young adults, and they also write about themselves in the future, how they will be and how they will change. But I think it's important too that what he's registering is that although he's not able to articulate why these items are important, he's still concerned that they're passed on, that they go to the next generation. Other times, objects, mementos, were the source of regret. The only mementos that I'm aware of is a letter from my dad's grandfather sent during World War I. Unfortunately, his wife cleared the house of many things, including photographs, when she thought she was dying. So it's very likely any such mementos were disposed of then very sadly, as I know my mum would have loved to have had such things. So she doesn't talk about herself, but she talks about the elder generation and marks the absence. I think that's important because it's not just about what's there, it's also about what's missing and what's mourned. It's not much, or it's enough. I think these are quite interesting words. First of all, it's not much. My great-uncle was killed on the Somme, just short of his 23rd birthday. There was nothing particular about Alfred and nothing heroic. He just died. There is no grave. His name is on the memorial at Thiepval. He was the only member of that generation in my family. I have his cap badge, which I wear on the left on my Remembrance Sunday. I have his tunic buttons and his service medals, as well as the letter his father received, thanking him for his son's service. It's not much, she writes. I think this is quite a poignant extract in lots of ways. She makes the case that it's not much, but it's clearly a lot. She writes about it in detail. She writes about it quite movingly. She's very sparse in her use of language. It's deliberately ambiguous because it's clear that the lot is the scale of the sacrifice and that there's not much to show for such a great sacrifice. And she also, by saying it's not much, makes it very deliberate, very matter of fact, the mundane fact of his death. So I think that's telling in the sense that the artefacts that she's listing play a material function in terms of the fact that she wears them, they're real. She actually plays an active role in the British Legion in her community, but at the same time she has this narrative around what they mean and what they signify in terms of the experience of war more generally. Another respondent talked about an artefact being enough. My granddad was gassed and captured, worked on a German farm. He would never talk about World War I and died early as a result. I have one, and that's underlined, picture of him in uniform, and I will never forget. The photo is enough. It's really interesting that for one person it's not much, and for another it's enough, because it's enough that it's a prompt to remembrance. For others, artefacts, photos facilitated imaginative engagement with the experiences of dead ancestors. My family's stories are of World War II. Again, the slippage between World War II and World War I. My family's stories are of World War II rather than World War I, but I do have one rather lovely memento of World War I. It is a portable inkwell and belonged to my great-great-uncle who had worked in the post office prior to signing up. I love it, as I can imagine him writing letters home by candlelight, and it makes it feel real for me. I think this is really interesting, because the tangibility of the object makes something real. It makes it a link which she can understand and that she can engage with. They are, talking about the World War I artefacts, this is another mass observer, are important to us, and here she's talking for the family, not just because one of the pieces has a direct personal link, but also because each piece represents the boys and men who were swept up by the theatre of war, each playing their part and telling their own unique story. When I hold the postcards and read them, I can almost hear their voices as they write the words. I feel like I'm holding a little time machine in my hand. I know it sounds a bit silly, she's justifying her position. But for example, one of the postcards is from a British father to his daughter. He tells her how much he misses and loves her, and asks her to tell her brothers and her mummy that he misses and loves them too. He enclosed a photograph of himself for them to keep. This made me cry. Again, that emotional engagement. From the rest of the information on the card, I managed to find out who he was. Sadly, this lovely man was killed at the front in October 1917. So these postcards then speak very directly to this mass observer and make her engage with them in a particular way which involves emotion. And in fact, as I've written elsewhere, that the very fact of becoming emotional seems to be read as evidence of engaging with the past, which I think is interesting. Others talked in fact, acting dishonourably in relation to World War I artefacts. My great-great-grandfather fought in the First World War and he was awarded medals which are still in the family today. They are more important to some members of my family than they are to others. Those family members, and the grammar's not quite right here, to which they are least important are only interested in wanting to sell them one day due to their own selfishness. So there we can see the sort of the contradictory narrative around, not contradictory, but the other side to nurture is this is for profit, this is for individual gain. Others, particularly those who were elderly and for whom the First World War had been the experience of their parents, talked about not texts, not artefacts, but they talked about the experiences of war being written on their parents' bodies. And they talked about disfigurement. And they talked about the oddness of relatives, the fact they didn't necessarily engage well in social situations. They talked about a grandfather's bleeding ears. And they talked about deafness. So they talked too about bodies as sites of remembrance, not just about text, not just about artefacts. Okay, so I've talked through some of the ways that artefacts and objects play a role in remembrance. I want to talk now about what performing remembrance might mean in terms of some of the practices associated with these artefacts, with these objects, with these photographs and so on. For some, and this was only a very few of the directive responses, it meant displaying particular objects prominently, whether that was in the hall, whether that was on the mantelpiece, displaying artefacts, but more commonly displaying photographs. So this was about a visible commemoration. We have a beautiful metal and wood trench periscope and an officer's whistle. I have a photograph of Alfred which is out on display because of the centenary, and my son Alfred has Alfred as his second name. So there's two aspects to this. I think it's interesting that she notes the aesthetic qualities of this artefact, and I wonder if the item hadn't been quite so beautiful, whether she'd been so keen to have it on display. So I think it's noteworthy that she mentions that. Also, of course, the commemoration through naming. That's another kind of visible circulation of memory. I am glad that I inherited an overpainted picture of my grandfather in uniform on a horse. I now have it proudly displayed in my office at home. So there were quite a few of these kind of display stories, but what was never clear, and they didn't answer this in terms of the directive question, was to explain why. To explain why was it important to display these mementos, these artefacts, these photographs? Why was that important? So they very much, although they were directly asked to answer this, I think it's interesting that they didn't talk about that. And I started off by saying that there's this sense of doing honour to previous generations, but I'm surprised at how little that's come through, and it didn't come through when they were talking about why, about the display of particular photographs. So that's quite interesting, an interesting absence. I have 3 framed silk postcards of World War I. They hang in my hall. The man who sent them never returned, and his body was never found. So I think that's interesting because the objects aren't just commented on. The absence of the person who wrote the postcards is what's significant there. Okay, so there's quite a lot around displaying objects, but there's also some ceremonial and a ritualistic function to some of the artefacts as well. Thinking particularly about ceremonies, one of my uncles was commemorated in the 1980s when his name was finally added to the war memorial and a book was published. My mother and other family members were traced to surviving relatives and invited to the unveiling. I remember how proud and emotional my mother felt to be able to acknowledge her uncle and make that link with family history for surviving relatives. I think it's quite interesting here that we have the mother acting as this delegate for the family as a whole at this ceremony. I always mark Remembrance Day. At this time, I especially remember and acknowledge these members of my family who were involved but whom I never knew. I think that's significant as well because it's about the personal dimension to public commemoration. So although we might think of public commemorative events around Remembrance Sunday as being about the mass of soldiers who've died, for this particular individual, it's personal to her because it's about her family members, and that's how she understands the meaning of that event. For another mass observer, he talked about this ritual of looking at the photograph he has of Soldier Cyril and consciously thinking of him. So he sets aside time to consciously go and reflect and think about this particular person at 11 a.m. on the 11th day of the 11th month. And it is actually something he's done for several years. This is active remembering. My mother always referred to her cousin who died in the Great War as Soldier Cyril. I became much more personally affected when I was given a book by the niece of Soldier Cyril. The book gives details of where Cyril was buried, and I now have a photograph of his gravestone in the Sucrerie Military Cemetery. I look at these photographs at 11 a.m. on the 11th of November each year. It focuses my thoughts on not only Cyril, but all those who lost their lives in both world wars. I think it's really telling that this person has his own personal kind of commemorative activity going on here. But again, there's this relationship between this particular individual who is a relative and the way that that relative then comes to stand in for the loss of so many human lives more generally. So there's a relationship between the two. I'm not going to talk about visiting battlefields here because that could be a paper just on its own, but for the majority of those who'd visited battlefields, that had been very poignant, where they had been able to find a particular ancestor who'd been buried, particularly where they'd had no kind of other knowledge about them other than to see the gravestone. Okay, so that's some account of performing remembrance. A little bit about family history and its role in reproducing or challenging official histories. I'm sure you won't be surprised to hear that there were very familiar tropes around the meaning of World War I and the experiences of World War I. So we had stories of the young soldier cut down in the prime of life, leaving behind a sweetheart. We had stories of the pals. We also had stories of the home front not being that bad in the countryside, and slight guilt and shame around that actually their family hadn't experienced the same degree of privation that others had. We also had, though, stories around stigmatised identities. For example, one chap who'd had the death sentence for desertion. My sister was shocked by the revelations of his death sentence. He felt ashamed of what might have been regarded as cowardice, especially as there was a great stigma about it in the Great War. Myself, he says, I feel quite a respect for him. We can only imagine the horrors that these young men must have seen and experienced, the senseless waste and futility of it all. To have turned your back on it, even for just 4 days, must have taken some courage. Any sane person would have done the same. A really interesting, reflective engagement with the meaning of that action. So we can see that desertion, which wasn't talked about in the family because it was seen as being shameful, is now being recuperated as something which is a perfectly human reaction to an unrecognisably horrific situation. For others, though, there was a shadow of guilt cast across the whole family for their father not having taken part in the war. I only have memories of my father talking about the war. My father talked a lot about not having to fight. No mementos, only that awareness all my life of his guilt that he wasn't involved in the fighting. It's a really interesting story. Also, in that particular respondent's account, it was very interesting that the reason that had assumed such significance in her life was because of the Second World War breaking out, and that had then meant that her father had to rehearse this narrative about why he hadn't fought in the First World War. So actually the Second World War had brought all sorts of demons to light in terms of the legacy of the First World War. So it's a relationship between the two. There were also accounts of white feather stories. R.E. tried to join up. He suffered from extreme short-sightedness and was turned down. A short time later he was handed a white feather by a woman, of course for cowardice. This upset him terribly and he tried again to sign up. By this time a shortage of men meant he was signed up. He was shot by a sniper that he couldn't see in April 1918. Photographs of this young man in heavy glasses, smart in his uniform, are unbearably sad. So she really engages with and reflects on his experience. However, for some though, The family memory isn't of solidarity on the battlefield or shared deprivation, but actually bitterness and bad memories. So for one respondent, her father-in-law had talked about his father, a man old before his time, and he talked about other soldiers stealing the cake that had been sent from home, and that he had never forgotten this and never forgiven it either. Okay. The relationship then between individuals, family, community and nation. I will finish soon. I'll do very well to stay awake so late in the afternoon. We can see then that, as I've just said, that there's this kind of patterning of stories among the directive responses in familiar ways, with particular stories figuring again and again. For lots of mass observation respondents writing about the First World War who had family stories to recount, they described these as typical, actually. What was significant about their family's experiences and their ancestors' experiences in the First World War wasn't their specificity or their particularity. It was actually the fact that they were evidence of a much greater mass of men and women who had experienced these things. So they wrote about themselves as typical cases. So they were very clearly contextualising those experiences within a broader historical narrative. They talked about their First World War people as being nothing special and thus absolutely typical. They also talked about the way that family members were listed on war memorials and the link between family history and local history. And one of the examples I gave before was about that commemoration activity, about the uncle being added onto the war memorial and being added into the book. Another wrote really interestingly about the fact that she was a refugee and the First World War had nothing to do with her at all, but that it was still important to her because she went to all the commemorative activities as a way of saying thank you. A really touching story. However, for some there was a dissonance between family history and national history, in the sense that there was no memory in the family of either world wars being Irish, of it not fitting with these official narratives, these around the meaning of the war. I certainly sympathise with that, as being half Polish, and the 11th of November is Independence Day, so a time of celebration. For others it was about being let down, not being able to draw a widow's pension when the family felt she should have been entitled, for example. I know of no souvenirs. My family never observed Remembrance Day. There was bitterness, at least for my mother, which I presumed that she inherited, that my great-grandparents had been let down by the army, that times were very tough for them and they got no help. So there is this kind of critical take on commemoration as well. Okay, last point. I'm going to talk finally about relationships and connectedness in the past, present and future, between and among the generations, just to sum up, really. That what I'm trying to tease out here is not just that family stories around the First World War bind families together, not just in terms of the stories that they're told, but the practices around telling those stories, but they also bind together in silence and in secrecy. That is no less a binding together, but it's a different kind of binding together. There are silences, there are deliberate forgettings, if we can put it like that, or time-limited forgettings, so the stories can only be explored when key family members have died, and that story can then be told. Or there may be no stories at all. My mum and dad both tell me that wartime stories were not discussed in their families. If they were, stories were kept to simple matters of fact rather than sharing any personal experience. I can certainly vouch for this. And of course it's the personal experiences that family historians tend to treasure. My father's two brothers, Pat and Hugh, returned, one severely shell-shocked and the other so damaged you couldn't touch his skin. People didn't talk about it, so awful. Only now, when they're all dead, are stories emerging. Like I found in relation to family history more generally, many wished they'd asked more questions when the older generation had been alive, and many talked also as family historians or as being the eldest within the family of the role of the elder generation to pass on information and artefacts to the next generation. These mementos are extremely precious to me, and I hope they will be well taken care of once I too hit the trail to eternity, as one writes. I am now the oldest member of my family, and I realise that if I do not learn about our past, right? So he's speaking for everybody, the whole family, and disseminate this knowledge, so not just that he has to collect this information, but he has to share it, it will have gone forever. So again, that idea that the past has to be nurtured, it has to be collected, it has to be maintained, and it has to be transmitted to be meaningful. Like everyone else, I wish I'd asked more questions. One reason I have not done much about my maternal side is that my mother asked me not to until she was dead. She felt very bitter about her father. The last point I want to make is that I've talked about the positive engagements that individuals, mass observers, have had with family history in terms of their kind of identification with particular experiences, their particular practices around objects and artefacts. But there's critique as well. There's quite a lot of critique. And I've raised in passing the critique around commemoration, but I also want to raise the critique of this emotional connectedness through family history. It is a fairly recent phenomenon, and one perhaps linked with the rise in interest in researching family history, but I have noticed the sentimental adoption by people of a forebear who died in the conflict as a kind of First World War mascot. Recently, a programme called Teenage Tommies featured a type of photograph already so familiar as to have become a cliché: modern descendants staring into the camera and looking doleful, holding portraits of their dead in distant military relations. I imagine a production assistant removing a portrait and swapping it with that held by another and saying, sorry, you have the wrong dead relative," which would be an apt way of summing up the arbitrariness and, to me, emptiness of such supposed emotional connections. So for some, it's very meaningful and something which has purchase, but for others, it's something which they're deeply sceptical of and suspicious of. The last thing I want to finish on is one response. There was no writing at all, but he'd submitted a kind of, I don't know even what to call it, cartoon seems far too, I could never produce anything like that, very impressive. It's called Remembering in the Correct Manner, and I'll read you which, from left to right. Is thinking about it the same as remembering? I am wearing a poppy. I must be remembering. Is this the day... in this day and age, it is all about anticipation. The numbers look good. Whose history is this? With a cup of tea. Which bit are we actually remembering? With a phone. And lastly, what have I learned? It gives you a flavour of some of the critique of the politics of commemoration, not necessarily linked directly into family history, but it's part and parcel of the same critique. So to conclude then, what I've tried to tease out is the fact that, as well as having different individual dispositions to the meaning of past, what respondents talk about is different familial cultures relating to the significance of the past within their families. Which families do and don't talk about the past as being significant. There's also a key generational dimension here in terms of family history being passed from one family member to the other, down the generations, that this is a process that needs to be nurtured, that there are expectations and obligations of different family members in regard to this, but that family history, family heritage is not valued by all, and indeed the practice of commemoration generally isn't valued by all, as we can see from this graphic. There's much more to say, which I haven't got time to do, as I've said, around attitudes to the commemoration of the First World War. But I think it's very interesting that many of the mass observers who have historical awareness are themselves very critical of commemoration and very critical of World War I commemorative activities in particular. So I wonder whether this might be a case, as John has written, about critical citizenship in action. It might be. I'm going to have a look and see. Thank you.